If I disappeared for a few weeks, probably no one would even notice. The sentence was spoken very softly, as if it were just an offhand comment made while cleaning up after dinner. My mother didn't raise her voice. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was still standing by the stove, brushing a few crumbs into her palm, her eyes drifting toward the window where the porch light cast its familiar pale yellow glow. It was a very American dinner, very ordinary. Roast chicken still warm, mashed potatoes already cooling, an old radio on the shelf playing the local news that no one was really listening to. At that moment, I was standing at the sink. The water ran steadily, warm. My hand slipped slightly on a glass. A dry clink sounded as the base of the glass tapped against the stainless steel sink. It didn't shatter, just chipped at one corner. The sound wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to feel my heart hitch for a brief beat. I smiled out of reflex, a familiar smile, almost unconscious. I turned off the water, dried my hands on the dish towel hanging beside the stove, then picked up the glass, turning it slowly in my palm, looking for the chipped edge. I set it aside and stacked it with the others as if that was simply what needed to be done, as if everything was still fine. No one turned to look at me. The radio continued. My mother stayed where she was, completely unaware that she had just said something that would stay with me for a very long time. There are sentences like that. Not meant to hurt, not born of cruelty, but they follow you for the rest of your life. Quietly, persistently, like the small chip on a glass you still use every day. You don't notice it right away, until one evening the light hits it just right, and you see it more clearly than ever. I stood there for a few more seconds, watching the water drip from the edge of the sink, and asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Was my real fear being disliked? Or was it that no one would even notice I had ever been there? Not being pushed away, not being rejected, but fading, disappearing neatly and gently, so smoothly that no one felt the absence. I grew up in a family where silence was often given nicer names. Being understanding, knowing your place. Don't make things complicated. I learned very early how to swallow my feelings so the food wouldn't get cold, so the evening wouldn't feel heavy, so no one would have to sigh. I thought that was how you kept the peace. I thought that was kindness. But maybe somewhere inside us, especially in women who are used to putting themselves last, there is a very specific fear. If I speak up, will I still be allowed to stay? And if I stay silent long enough, will there come a day when I truly disappear, just like that sentence suggested? If you've ever heard a sentence like that, in your own kitchen, or at a family dinner that seemed harmless, maybe the story will stay with you tonight. Maybe you're listening to it in bed. The light's already dimmed. Maybe on the couch, after everyone else has gone to sleep. Or maybe in the kitchen, like I was then, hands still wet, not yet understanding what had just happened. Before I continue my story, let me ask you, where are you right now as you listen to these words? And if any moment here touches something in you, please stay until the end. This story was created with the support of AI and edited by a human. It's not meant to encourage anyone to imitate it, only to offer a perspective to reflect on, especially in the quietest hours of the day. At that time, I had no idea that sentence was only the first sign. That from the moment the chipped glass was set aside, a decision was forming inside me, a decision that would later make my entire family fall silent in a very different way. Looking back, I realized I was praised for being easy from a very young age. Not because I ate well or slept on schedule, but because I asked for little. I didn't ask why. I didn't whine. I didn't interrupt when adults were talking. In the old photographs lining the hallway, I'm usually standing slightly behind, hands folded neatly in front of me, eyes on the camera with a smile I'd already practiced. The family called that being understanding. I believed it too. My younger brother was different. He was allowed to be loud, allowed to make mistakes, allowed to break things and apologize later. When that happened, the family would sigh. But it was a familiar sigh, one that left room for fixing things. Me, when I did well, I got a brief nod of approval. When I stayed quiet, I was considered well behaved. I learned a lesson very early on. Stepping back at the right moment was the fastest way to keep anyone from feeling uncomfortable. Gradually, stepping back became a reflex. At family gatherings, I listened more than I spoke. When conversations heated up, I changed the subject. When someone forgot to ask my opinion, I told myself it probably wasn't that important. Everything moved along smoothly. No friction, no noise. I thought I was helping keep the peace. But the body doesn't lie. After that dinner, with my mother's words still hanging somewhere in the kitchen, I heard a chair scrape softly. No one asked me to do anything. And yet I stood up. I gathered the plates, stacked them neatly, placed them in the sink in the familiar order. Knives and forks crossed, napkins folded, everything happened smoothly, like a scene from a movie that had been replayed too many times. It wasn't until I carried the last tray into the kitchen that I suddenly realized I was the only one standing. People were still seated in the dining room. The conversation continued, uninterrupted. No one noticed. The moment passed quickly, but it was enough to stop me. I set the tray down more slowly than usual. I leaned lightly against the counter and took a deep breath, as if I had just climbed a long flight of stairs. I stood still for a few seconds, and for the first time a question appeared clearly in my mind. Is silence really kindness, or just a tidy way of disappearing? I didn't blame anyone. The question carried no anger. It simply sat there, heavier than I expected. From that day on, a low, persistent exhaustion followed me around the house. Not tired from doing too much, but tired from always having to know when to step back. I did everything the same way, but something no longer fit. Like that chipped glass mixed in with the others in the cabinet, every time I touched it, I felt a small, sharp edge. Not enough to hurt, but enough to remind me it was there. I began to notice something that was hard to name. Not sadness, not anger, but the sense that something inside me was wearing down very slowly, very steadily, every time I chose silence so things could just move along. I didn't yet know what to do with that realization. I only knew that since the moment I stood alone in the kitchen, I was no longer sure my silence was as harmless as I once believed. That family meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon after church. There was no long table or formal atmosphere, just the familiar living room with beige carpeting and sunlight slanting through the curtains. My mother sat at the end of the sofa, hands resting on her knees the way she always did when she was about to say something important. My father stood by the fireplace, flipping through a thin stack of papers. I recognized the signs immediately, even before anyone spoke. They talked quickly, as if everything had already been decided. A plan directly involving me, my time, a decision that would affect the coming months. But no one asked me a question. Not the kind of oversight where someone simply forgets. The kind that comes from being used to my agreement. I was informed, although in a gentle voice, even one that sounded caring. I sat there, hands on my thighs, listening like an outsider in my own story. The old reflex rose up fast. I felt my head tilt down slightly, just enough to signal, that's fine. My body had learned this long ago, learned how to smooth things over so no one had to explain further. I opened my mouth, ready to say the word I had used so many times before in moments like this. But the word didn't come out. Not because I stopped it on purpose. It just didn't arrive. I sat there, lips parting, then closing again. The silence stretched longer than usual, longer than the safe pause I was used to. For a few seconds, the room seemed to hold still. My father looked up. My mother tilted her head slightly, her eyes passing over me as if waiting for a familiar signal that hadn't appeared. My heart began to beat faster, not loudly, but urgently. I felt heat rise to my face. Part of me panicked, afraid of being seen as selfish, afraid of disrupting the calm atmosphere the family had maintained for years, afraid that if I didn't say yes, everything would become complicated. I looked down at my hands. My thumb was unconsciously rubbing along the edge of my index fingernail, an old habit whenever I was tense. I took a slow breath, grounding myself. No one spoke, no one rushed me. But that very waiting made me realize this moment was no longer like the others. Finally, I spoke. Not loudly, not firmly, just enough to fill the space. I said I needed time to think. The sentence landed in the living room like a foreign object. It made no loud sound, but it was enough to make everyone pause. My mother pressed her lips together. My father shifted his stance. No one objected, but no one smiled either. When the conversation moved on to another topic, I stayed seated, listening without really hearing. In my mind, a new understanding was slowly taking shape. The silence wasn't the familiar retreat. It didn't let everything glide past smoothly. It made people wait for me. It made them notice the space where my answer usually appeared. I left the living room with a strange feeling, Not relief, not regret, just a very clear realization. There are times when silence isn't about disappearing, but about holding space for yourself. And I knew that from that moment on, my silences would never all be the same again. In the days that followed, no one said outright that they were unhappy. Everything went on as usual, except there was a thin, cooler layer in the air, settling over familiar routines. My mother began watching me more closely. My father asked fewer questions. There were no arguments, no reproaches, just the feeling that someone had shifted a chair slightly out of place, and everyone in the room knew it, but no one wanted to touch it to fix it. "You've been different lately," my mother said one morning while I was making coffee. Her voice was soft, light, as if she were commenting on the weather. I heard the spoon tap against the mug, metal ringing faintly. I nodded, not to agree, but to show that I had heard her. I didn't explain. I didn't say I was still me. I didn't say I was just slowing down. I left the sentence hanging there between us. I realized their discomfort didn't feel like anger. It felt like prolonged confusion, like when a long-standing habit suddenly changes and you don't know where to put your hands. I no longer filled the familiar gaps. I no longer stepped in to smooth things over. I no longer anticipated and adjusted. I was still present, just in a different way, and that unsettled them more than I had expected. One afternoon, as the family sat down to eat, my mother pulled out my chair and placed it in its usual spot, closer to the table, the way she always did. It was a very small gesture, almost unconscious. I looked at the chair, then at her. I smiled lightly, pulled the chair back just a bit, leaving enough space for me to feel comfortable. No one said anything. Silverware touched plates softly. I sat down, back straight, hands on the table. I didn't move it back. That moment lasted exactly one breath, long enough for everyone to realize something wasn't returning to the way it had been. No one objected. No one reminded me. But that meal moved more slowly than usual, as if everyone was adjusting to a new rhythm. At one point, I stood by the window looking out at the backyard where the leaves were beginning to change color. And a thought formed in my mind, clearer than anything before. When someone stops playing their old role, the whole system is forced to reveal itself. Not because that person has done something wrong, but because what once ran smoothly is no longer automatic. For the first time, I understood something I had never considered before. They didn't hate me. They weren't trying to make me smaller. They were afraid. Afraid of losing the familiar order that had carried everything along for so many years. Afraid of having to adjust. Afraid of re-examining roles that had been arranged for too long. That realization didn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it came with a very specific cost. Change didn't just leave me feeling out of place, it also forced me to witness the discomfort of the people I loved. There were no crashes, no dramatic climax, just small moments where I had to choose between returning to my old position so everyone else could feel at ease, or holding my new ground so I wouldn't lose myself. And for the first time, I saw clearly that change, no matter how gentle, always has a price. Not everyone is willing to pay it with you. But some values, once you've seen them, you can no longer pretend you never did. That decision came on a drizzly afternoon when the whole family stood in the garage discussing renovations to the room at the back of the house. Not a major change, but one that directly involved time and money I had saved over many months. I leaned against the car, listening as they went back and forth, sentences flowing quickly, as if everything were already settled. No one turned to ask what I thought. Not because they forgot, but because they were used to me stepping in later to fix things if something went wrong. This time I said nothing. I listened, nodded when necessary, but didn't interject. I didn't point out the small details I knew would become problems. I didn't offer alternatives. I let the decision pass through me, like a train I didn't board. When everyone else drifted away, I stayed in the garage for a few more seconds, watching rainwater streak across the concrete floor, and felt a strange emptiness. A few weeks later, the consequences appeared. Nothing serious, no one lost a lot of money, just that the room didn't function the way they had imagined. The windows faced the wrong direction, the light was insufficient. A few details had to be redone, costing extra time. Complaints began to surface at dinner, gentle but clear. I sat there, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, listening like a guest. For a moment, my mother's eyes flicked toward me, waiting. An old habit. Waiting for me to say I could fix it. Waiting for me to step in and make everything right again. I didn't. The moment was brief, but enough for me to feel the shift in the room. The air thickened. A gap opened where the familiar solution used to be. I felt my heart tighten for a quick beat. Guilt rose first. I thought about the inconveniences everyone was dealing with. I thought about how one sentence, one action, could smooth everything out like before. But right after that, another feeling slipped in. Lighter, but steadier. Relief. I didn't have to carry this fix. Not because I couldn't, but because for the first time I wasn't automatically doing it just to keep my place in the family. That night, while washing dishes, I saw the chipped glass still sitting on the shelf. I touched the broken edge, feeling the familiar sharpness. A thought surfaced clearly. All this time, I had been the one fixing small flaws like that, not just with objects, but with other people's decisions. I patched things up, smoothed them over so everything would look fine. And in return, I got to stay. I was considered useful. I was seen as not being a burden. That realization held me still for a long time. Water overflowed the sink, spilled over the edge, dripping onto the floor. I hurried to turn off the faucet, wiped everything dry out of old habit, then stopped. I asked myself whether I was wiping because I was afraid of damaging the floor or because I was afraid of disorder. When I went to bed that night, the rain was still tapping steadily on the porch roof. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the quiet fixes I'd made in the past, and the first time I hadn't. The loss this time was small, almost insignificant. But I knew that some things, once you stop fixing them the way you used to, can never return to their original state. And a question began to form clearer than ever. If I keep not stepping in to fix things, not filling the gaps, not rescuing the situation, what will happen next? The conversation with my mother happened on a quiet evening when the house had finally settled after a long day. I was folding towels in the laundry room when she stopped in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the wooden frame, as if she wasn't sure whether she should step in or not. The warm yellow light fell across her face, making the wrinkles around her eyes more visible, softer. I recognized that familiar feeling right away. Something was waiting to be said, but didn't want to be named. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No one made tea, no one asked questions just to circle around it. My mother looked at me for a long time, then said, her voice low and slow, "I just want you not to make everything complicated." The sentence dropped between us, not heavy, but enough for me to feel my chest close in very slightly, in a single quiet beat. I understood immediately what she meant. My new silences, the times I didn't answer right away, the decisions I no longer fixed for everyone. She didn't call it change, she called it complicated. As if everything before had been fine and I was the one tangling it up. I was about to explain, about to say I wasn't trying to make things hard for anyone, about to say I was just learning how to breathe more slowly. But I stopped. I let the answer rise in my throat, then fade away. I looked down at the tabletop where a thin scratch ran along the grain of the wood, a scratch that had been there for a long time but only showed up when you looked closely. "You're afraid things will be different," I said after a while, my voice lower than I expected. Not a question, not an accusation, just an observation I set gently on the table. My mother didn't respond right away. She turned her head and looked out the window, where the dark glass held a faint reflection of her own face. In that moment, a slow realization formed in me, so clear I felt my heart soften. Don't make everything complicated didn't mean don't hurt, don't think, don't feel. It meant don't be different. Don't step out of the role that had already been arranged. Don't make what's familiar shift. I answered slowly, no arguing, no denial. I just said I was trying to understand myself better. That sentence didn't solve anything immediately. But it stood there, spine straight, without apologizing. Some families don't hate you. They just don't know how to love you when you change. That thought didn't make me as sad as I expected. It made me feel tenderness. Tenderness for the clumsiness of people who love each other in the only way they know how. But tenderness no longer meant I had to make myself smaller to fit. When I stood up, my mother was still sitting there, her hands resting on the table, her eyes following me. I knew she wasn't ready. I also knew I couldn't wait until everyone was ready before I lived. That night, in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the need to explain more. There was just a new boundary, faint but real, slowly taking shape inside me. Not a wall, not a declaration, just a space I chose to keep, so I could stand upright without asking permission. And for the first time, I understood that love isn't always making everything easy. Sometimes it's being willing to let things be a little harder so you don't lose yourself in the process. I didn't tell anyone I was going to change. There was no announcement, no family meeting to clear the air. I just showed up differently, very slowly, very gently, like changing the rhythm of my breathing without warning. I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer felt the need to explain every reaction I had. I also stopped asking permission for things that were, in truth, personal choices, like my schedule, like whether I stayed or left. The changes were so small that if you weren't paying attention, you could miss them. But in a family that runs on habit, even the smallest shift can expose the uneven beat. I saw that most clearly on a weeknight, when everyone sat down to eat like usual, nothing special about the meal. A stew my mother had started that morning, bread in the middle of the table, the TV on the local news at a volume just loud enough to be there. When we finished eating, I stood up earlier than I normally did. Not because I had somewhere to rush off to, just because I felt done. I took my plate, set it neatly in the sink, then came back to the table and said I was going upstairs to rest early. My voice was calm, no apology, no extra explanation. My mother looked up, slightly surprised. My father watched me, like he was trying to figure out whether he'd missed something. No one stopped me. No one asked what's wrong. But I could feel confusion spread quickly, like a small ripple running along the tabletop. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of a familiar clock suddenly ticking one beat faster. I climbed the stairs, the wood creaking softly under my feet. Halfway up, I paused for a second. Something in me sank. The old fear rose up, sharp and clear. If I go, will I be left behind? If I'm not there to fill the gaps, will my place disappear? I stood still, one hand on the railing, listening to the voices drifting up from the dining room. They kept talking. No one called my name, no one scolded me. That was exactly what made the fear in me stand out even more. But I kept going, not faster, not slower. I walked forward carrying that fear, instead of turning back to soothe it. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, took off my watch, and set it on the nightstand. A tiny action, but I did it more slowly than usual, as if reminding myself that I was here, in my own room. I didn't feel like I'd won. I didn't feel like I'd lost something huge either. It was just a heavy, steady feeling, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for far too long. In the days that followed, I kept showing up that way, not disappearing, not confronting anyone, just not automatically appearing at the exact moment to make everything run smoothly. My family adjusted very slowly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with long stretches of silence, but no one exploded, no one pushed me away. That helped me understand something important. A boundary doesn't have to be loud to be real. The value of these changes started to show up not through anyone else's reaction, but through what it did inside me. I slept more deeply. I breathed more evenly. I didn't have to constantly check whether I was disappointing someone. I still feared being abandoned, but that fear no longer controlled every step I took. There was no big climax here, just small choices repeated every day. But in that repetition, I began to feel myself steadier. Not because everything around me had changed, but because for the first time, I wasn't leaving myself behind just to be allowed to stay. I started slowing down in a very specific way. Not slow as an escape, but slow so I could hear the rhythms I'd ignored for too long. I woke up a little earlier, drank coffee in silence, watched the light fill the windowsill before the day got loud. I organized my time around small breaks, not stuffing every gap with responsibility or old habits. That rhythm wasn't fighting anyone, it just wasn't built around reacting quickly to everything anymore. My family started noticing that absence, but not in a dramatic way. No one said outright that I'd changed. It was just that empty spaces began appearing where I used to be. One dinner without someone reminding them to turn on the porch light. One morning without anyone asking if I was free to swing by and help with a small task. At first, those absences were faint, like when you always keep your keys in one spot and you don't realize they're not there until the moment you need them. One afternoon, while I was walking around the neighborhood, my phone buzzed in my pocket. My mother's name lit up the screen. I pulled it out, looked at it for a few seconds, then slipped it back into my pocket. Not out of anger, not to teach anyone a lesson. I was just in the middle of a sunlit street, wind moving through the maple trees, and I wanted to finish that stretch of road without being pulled back into the old rhythm. The call ended. There wasn't a text right after. I kept walking, hearing dry leaves crackle under my shoes. A part of me tightened, just a little. I was used to picking up immediately, used to being available. Not answering right away made me realize I was doing something unusual, and that very unfamiliarity made me more awake than I'd been in a long time. That night, when I got home, I set my phone on the table and stared at it for a long time. No additional calls, no scolding, just a long stretch of quiet, and I understood something deeper than I ever had before. Intentional silence is not the same as silence that begs. One comes from knowing where you are and choosing to stay there. The other comes from fear of being left behind and hoping someone will pull you back in. I didn't wait for my family to change. I didn't wait for them to call again as proof of anything. I let life move at its own pace, the way I was learning to live. Some nights, I sat alone and read a few pages, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock. Sometimes I felt a brief wave of sadness, but I no longer felt that familiar emptiness. I was here with myself, and I didn't need anyone to confirm that. Before bed, I put my phone on silent and turned it face down. A small act, but I did it with awareness. I didn't know whether they would call again tomorrow. I didn't know what this silence would lead to. I only knew that for the first time, silence no longer meant disappearing. And as the bedroom light dimmed, a question rose quietly inside me, unhurried, not demanding an answer right away. If they call again, how will I answer? The call came back on a weekday morning while I was watering the plants on the porch. The sunlight was still gentle, the water from the hose drawing small circles into the ground. The phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. This time I pulled it out right away, saw the name on the screen, and answered after one breath. My mother's voice on the other end was slower than usual. Not clearly worried, not scolding, just a simple opening question like she'd thought it over many times before saying it. She asked how I'd been lately, nothing more. She didn't ask why I hadn't picked up the other day. She didn't mention the changes that had been happening. A late question, incomplete, but enough for me to hear what was underneath. I stood still holding the hose, letting the water run off to the side. In that moment, I realized I had so much I could say. I could tell her about sleeping better, about not feeling like I had to stay on alert, about the tangled feelings that had brought me here. But I didn't. I didn't use that open space to pour everything out, to explain, to earn understanding. I'm okay, I said, two short words that didn't carry the whole long story behind them, but were real enough to stand on their own. I heard a few seconds of silence on the other end. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when someone is taking in something unfamiliar. My mother murmured, "Okay," like she was registering that answer, and then she talked a little about everyday things. The weather, someone we knew in the neighborhood, small details that weren't trying to lead anywhere. The call ended gently without a big echo. When I hung up, I stood there for a moment, listening to the water still running steadily, and felt a strange calm settle in. I looked back at the version of myself from a few weeks ago, the one who would have rushed to explain, who would have tried to fill every gap with words to prevent misunderstanding, the one who would have been afraid that if she didn't say enough, no one would know she was truly okay. And I realized what had changed. I no longer needed to be fully understood to feel safe. Not everyone had to hold my entire story for me to be myself. A new order began forming from tiny moments like that. Calls were no longer tests. Questions were no longer doors I had to walk through. I answered when it felt right. I stayed quiet when it felt like enough. And that was enough. That afternoon, I reorganized a shelf, slid a few books to the side, and uncovered an empty space. I didn't rush to fill it. I left it there, as part of the room, as part of me. This order didn't look like the old order, where everything had to fit perfectly so no one would feel uncomfortable. It made room for unevenness. It made room for questions that hadn't been fully answered yet. When I turned off the light that night, I knew I was moving very close to an ending. Not the end of a relationship, the end of a way of existing. I didn't know what future conversations would look like. I only knew that from the moment I said I'm okay without adding an explanation, I had laid the foundation for a new kind of steadiness. And in that steadiness, I was ready to step into the next part of the story, not in a defensive posture, but with a full presence, steady enough to stay without losing myself. I still saw my family. We still had dinner together on familiar occasions, still talked about ordinary things, the weather, work, someone down the street who had moved away. There was no grand moment of reconciliation. No one stood up to apologize. No one declared that everything was different. But it was different, in a quiet way that lasted longer than I expected. Not everyone changed. Some people held on to old habits. Some people still wanted me to return to the old rhythm, where everything ran more smoothly for them. I realized I no longer needed to pull everyone back to the same point. I let each person stay in their own rhythm, and I kept enough space for myself to breathe. That didn't make me more distant from them. It only meant I stopped disappearing in the spaces between. I didn't need to win. I didn't need to prove I was right or that someone else was wrong. The steadiness I found didn't come from other people changing for me, but from me no longer forcing myself back into an old role just to be accepted. There were evenings I left early and didn't feel guilty. There were calls I answered and calls I returned the next day. I chose, and that choice no longer came with fear. What I kept for myself was an inner steadiness, something that didn't need to be acknowledged or named. I slept better. I listened to my body more clearly. I no longer had to constantly check whether I was disappointing someone. I was present in my family, but in the way of someone who no longer shrinks to fit other people's expectations. I didn't disappear. I just stopped blending into the background. I stood there more clearly without being loud. And the final understanding came to me naturally. Some relationships only hold when you no longer have to trade yourself away just to stay. Not everyone will be comfortable with the new version of you, but that doesn't mean that version is wrong. The story you just heard is fictional, inspired by very real situations and very human experiences. It was told with the support of AI and edited by a human, meant to offer a perspective for reflection and learning, not to encourage anyone to imitate it. The value here isn't in deciding who is right or wrong, but in how someone learns to live with themselves after quiet, unseen hurts. If there's a small gift for you in this ending, maybe it's the permission to slow down a little and listen to what you actually need, instead of rushing to meet everything around you. If you stayed until these final moments, I truly thank you. Where are you listening to this story from? In the kitchen after everything has gone quiet? On your familiar couch, or in your bedroom before sleep? If this story touched any part of you, leave a comment and share what you felt. Liking, subscribing, or turning on notifications doesn't just help you not miss the next story. It can also be a small way of choosing something gentle for yourself today. Thank you for listening, and I hope that no matter what your night looks like, you find a little peace that belongs to you.